Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Maria Freire, President and Executive Director of the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health. In this 25th year of the FNIH, I am delighted to welcome you to an event that amplifies and underscores one of our guiding principles: science leads. The FNIH is known as a convener of the top research minds from leading public and private entities, federal agencies, major foundations, biopharmaceutical companies, and patient advocacy groups, all focused on building the best pathways to healthier populations worldwide. The leaders who have come together for today's discussion are quite simply awe-inspiring. At the table, we have the top minds of the World Health Organization, the National Institutes of Health, the Food and Drug Administration, Pfizer, and the third largest community foundation in the country, the Chicago Community Trust. They are here to share their stories about what it took to move us at breakneck speed through the COVID pandemic, which is far from over. Importantly, these remarkable individuals work daily to build the foundation for better science as we head into the future. We're also deeply honored to have National Geographic as a co-host of this event. As our moderator, Susan Goldberg is the editor-in-chief of National Geographic and editorial director of National Geographic Partners. She's the 10th editor and the first female editor of the magazine since it was first published in 1888. Under Susan's watch, National Geographic has been honored with 10 National Magazine Awards, was named the Webby Media Company of the Year for 2020, and has been named a Pulitzer Prize finalist 3 times. Susan has moderated panels at the World Economic Forum in Davos, addressed students on countless campuses, and spoken at venues large and small. She frequently represents the face of National Geographic on television, radio, and on digital platforms. Thank you, Susan and National Geographic Partners, for joining us as co-hosts of this forum. I would also like to offer our deep appreciation to the individuals and corporations who contributed to the FNIH Pandemic Response Fund and to the Judy and Peter Bloom Kovler Foundation. Dr. Judy Kovler came to us with the idea for an event of this nature and provided generous funding to make it a reality. So thank you so very, very much. Now, over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Dr. Freire. The last year and a half has turned a small group of doctors and scientists into familiar faces for the American public. People like Dr. Anthony Fauci of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, or Dr. Francis Collins of the NIH, or Dr. Rochelle Walensky of the CDC, who just today warned about a resurgence of the pandemic. Our program today allows us to hear from some leaders we haven't heard quite as much from, coming from across a broad spectrum of public, private, and philanthropic organizations. We'll talk to them about the roles they've played in the fight against the pandemic, very much an ongoing effort, and ask them to share what they've learned during this unprecedented time. We'll also talk about what we need to do differently going forward to help prevent another global crisis, and what we need to do to prepare for one just in case. We're going to start off today with Dr. Sumaya Swaminathan, who plays a critical role at the World Health Organization as its chief scientist. Every day, Dr. Swaminathan weighs in on health issues affecting citizens around the globe. The pandemic has tested her role in communicating WHO guidance on how to best avoid getting COVID-19 and the importance of vaccines in saving lives. Most recently, she's been urging the public not to mix and match COVID vaccines from different manufacturers. Dr. Swaminathan, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I want to share some reflections from the past year, the learnings, the challenges, and how WHO has responded. From the day on the 31st of January 2019, when we first heard about this outbreak of atypical pneumonia in Wuhan, and within 4 days, we had a disease outbreak newsletter that went out to all our focal points for the international health regulations in all our member states. This alerted them to the fact that there was this outbreak that could be possibly caused by a new unknown pathogen and that they should be looking out for more news. Luckily for us, the whole genome sequences of the virus were made public on the 11th of January by Chinese scientists. And this really helped the world, first of all, to know that this was a novel coronavirus. And so we could predict and guess at some of its properties and how it would spread and how it would behave. Scientists at the WHO labs, diagnostic tests, the RT-PCR tests, that could then be used for diagnosis and detection of this virus so that countries around the world could start screening people to see if they had the infection. And thirdly, we know now that vaccine developers also started work within a few days of knowing the whole genome sequence, because with the modern tools and technologies that we have today, you can develop vaccines if you know the whole genome sequence of the virus. And so from day one, I think science has played a very important role in this pandemic. The WHO convened the first global forum on research and innovation in February of 2020, brought together over 400 scientists, researchers, academics, and treating physicians to discuss and develop a research roadmap for COVID-19 that has guided all of the work that people around the world have done, not just on developing new tools, diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines, but also on social and behavioral science research, on infection prevention and control, on the epidemiology, on a research agenda to find out the origins of the virus, and very importantly, on ethical issues that have come up from time to time through this pandemic on which the WHO has provided a steer. We started the Solidarity Therapeutics trial in April of 2020 that was initially looking at repurposed drugs. This trial was conducted in over 30 countries at over 500 hospitals and provides a good example of how, with global collaboration, you can do clinical trials very quickly to answer questions, whether they are the use of repurposed drugs or immunomodulatory drugs or other kinds of drugs in order to reduce mortality due to COVID-19. And we know that we still need better treatments for COVID. And the other thing that we were challenged with was making recommendations in the face of very little new knowledge about this virus. And so the initial set of guidance documents, which went out within the first 14 days of January, were based on our knowledge of other respiratory viruses and the previous two coronaviruses, SARS and MERS. There was public health guidance on testing, diagnosis, how to manage people, how to isolate and quarantine contacts and so on. And as we learned more and more, initially from China and then from other countries, we kept updating our guidance and moved to something that we call a living approach to our guidelines, which means that we were constantly reviewing the literature, which has been huge and immense. The amount of work that's come out on COVID-19 is absolutely unprecedented. So just keeping up with that evidence, making sure that we pick, the good from the bad, because when there's too much information out there, you always have to have that discretion. And then doing the guidelines with an expert committee that's free of all conflicts of interest and making it available on digital platforms so people can access it around the world. The other challenge we've had to face is what we call the infodemic. The Director General, Dr. Tedros, coined this term way back in February of 2020, when he said that along with the pandemic, we have another dangerous trend, and that is the infodemic, which is an overproduction of knowledge and people just being flooded with all kinds of information. A lot of it good, but a lot of it is misinformation or disinformation that really ends up confusing people and preventing them from following the public health measures. And finally, I think in a pandemic, one needs global solidarity. Science can produce the solutions, but without solidarity, without collaboration, without acting in harmony, and without policies being aligned across national borders, it's very difficult to address a pandemic. And we've had the ups and downs over the last 18 months or so. I think it's a lesson that we can also learn for other big global health challenges which affect the whole world. You do need a global response. A country by country response will not do it. So these are some of my experiences that it both challenged and humbled me over the last 18 months. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Swaminathan. I'll definitely want to get back to you on that question of global solidarity. But first, let's turn to Dr. Cliff Lane, who serves as Clinical Director and Deputy Director for Clinical Research and Special Projects at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at NIH. Working alongside Dr. Fauci, his research has been instrumental in building global understanding in the biology that gives rise to infectious disease, as well as the development of treatments and vaccines. At the start of COVID, Dr. Lane was one of 2 U.S. scientists to join a WHO team of researchers to tour China for an up-close look at the epidemic. Dr. Lane?
Thank you for that kind introduction, Susan, and thank you, Maria, for the FNIH sponsoring this event. It was interesting that, my first sense that maybe something was going on with this outbreak in China that was going to be a bit different was in early January when I was in Liberia visiting one of our sites that we had established during the West Africa Ebola outbreak, and saw on CNN the fact that the Chinese in Wuhan were building 2 very large hospitals to care for patients with this new disease. I had been viewing this through the lens of SARS and MERS and thinking it might be something relatively time limited. This, I think, to me, was the first evidence that we might be heading into something quite different and quite bigger. I wasn't directly involved then until a week or so later when we had the first case in the U.S. and the cases in U.S. citizens aboard the Diamond Princess cruise ship. At that time, it became clear that there was going to be a need to do something in research. Our area, the area that I'm in, predominantly being therapeutics research, we looked to see what we might be able to do and do quickly, and working with our division of microbiology and infectious diseases, leverage some of our existing infectious diseases networks to come together to form a clinical trial program initially focused on the drug remdesivir, an antiviral drug that had been used in humans in Ebola without much success, but that had good activity in the test tube against the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So as we're putting together this study team, one of my jobs was to go to Japan to see if we could set up a site in Tokyo to be able to care for patients who were infected aboard the cruise ship. As I was getting on the plane, I received word that I had been selected to be part of this WHO mission, and then after a brief one-day visit in Japan, headed off to China. That was really quite an interesting experience to see the way the entire country of China had a singular focus on dealing with this disease. Every community center had updated numbers. Everyone was wearing a mask. Everyone basically was saying the same message, that we had to isolate people who were infected. And in fact, there they went even a step further and did some quarantining of the close contacts. It was clear at that time in China, they had about 85,000 cases, that with their public health measures, they were in fact able to get the disease under control. That certainly ended up not being the case virtually everywhere else in the world. There were 2 lessons that I took away from that visit that I think were helpful in shaping what we've done in the US. One was the fact that there were multiple different clinical research activities underway without any clear prioritization, such that the most important questions weren't necessarily being addressed in a priority order. And the second was that there was a great need for clinicians now dealing with a new disease to have some sort of guidance that they could rely on, similar to what Sumia had mentioned, the WHO guidelines. So as I came back, as we had discussions, it was clear that we wanted to put together a coordinated effort for our clinical trials, and working, with the leadership of the NIH director, the Foundation for the NIH, the Accelerating COVID Therapeutics and Vaccine, or ACTIVE program, was launched. This is a public-private partnership that involved multiple government entities such as NIH, CDC, the VA, Department of Defense, the FDA, as well as the private sector. And they've launched a series of trials trying to get answers about some of the most promising treatments as quickly as possible. I've personally been directly involved in the ACTIV-3 trial looking at hospitalized patients and the role of monoclonal antibodies. In the early data from these trials, it has become quite apparent that there is a heterogeneity in the disease state. And in fact, we're now trying to see if we can sort this out using different biomarkers, such as levels of antibodies to different proteins of the virus or the levels of the protein antigens of the virus in the bloodstream. Again, making a case that personalized medicine may be important in managing COVID-19. The other part of the lessons learned from the trip to China was the importance of guidelines. And at the request, at the time, Secretary Azar, we were asked to lead an effort to put together a NIH COVID-19 treatment guidelines panel. We leveraged individuals who had been helping us with HIV guideline panels, and with Henry Mazur and Trip Gulick as co-chairs, put together a group of 40 or so experts, drawing heavily from the infectious diseases community, the intensive care community, and other subspecialties such as hematology. The first guidelines came out on April 21st, and since that time, we've issued 26 major revisions and multiple one-page updates for urgent matters. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lane. Catherine Janssen is Pfizer's head of vaccine research and development. She's spent 28 years in this area, reviewing vaccines globally. In her role with Pfizer, Dr. Janssen reached out to collaborate with the German biomedical firm BioNTech in leading development of Pfizer's vaccine against COVID-19. This vaccine was issued first for emergency use authorization by the FDA less than 11 months after COVID-19 began infecting the public. Dr. Janssen?
Thank you, Susan, so much for the introduction, and Dr. Freer for the opportunity to be here today as part of this esteemed panel. I'm Carson Johnson. I lead Pfizer's Vaccine Research and Development Organization, an end-to-end organization with over 800 passionate and driven colleagues. So vaccines are one of the most effective public health interventions preventing life-threatening diseases. Their impact can really not be overstated, as they have played a pivotal role in eliminating or nearly eliminating deadly infectious diseases like smallpox and polio globally. Personally, I'm proud to have played a leading role in developing a vaccine for cervical and other HPV-related cancers and vaccines to prevent bacterial infections like those caused by Streptococcus pneumoniae, Neisseria meningitis. But even with these vast experiences, COVID-19 really forced us to think differently and challenge our convictions about drug and vaccine discovery and development and how we have developed life-saving vaccines in the past. Really, nothing in our lifetimes has prepared us for the pandemic caused by SARS-CoV-2. But the lessons we have learned will inform our efforts, hopefully, for decades to come, and will also position us to be better prepared for future pandemics. So in early 2020, our team at Pfizer was closely watching and reading everything we could about this mysterious respiratory virus coming out of China, and thinking about potential approaches to combat the virus. As we discussed, we recognized that this virus could lead to a pandemic, and if so, that a vaccine would probably be the best way to prevent broad spread. So while we were evaluating options for vaccine development in January of last year, Ugur Sain, the CEO of BioNTech, called to talk about their work on a COVID-19 vaccine. We had been working with BioNTech since July of 2018 to research and develop an mRNA vaccine to prevent influenza. So we were very familiar with their technology and also informed about the broad immune responses this new platform could induce. Not knowing what would be effective against SARS-CoV-2, this approach was very attractive to us, and we knew it was also the fastest possible way to develop a vaccine. So we also knew that Pfizer's end-to-end expertise and efficient infrastructure in research, clinical and process development, and manufacturing would be really a critical combination to help deliver a safe and effective, high-quality mRNA-based COVID-19 vaccine, and to do it also very quickly. So we had thousands of colleagues working on multiple aspects of the vaccine from the start, particularly on a path to test the vaccine candidate in clinical studies around the world, and how we would need to build manufacturing capabilities and start manufacturing at risk to ensure that if we would be successful, we were positioned to make the vaccine available at very large scale. We also knew we had to think very differently about vaccine R&D to identify areas where we could save precious time to bring a vaccine over the finish line. So developing a vaccine is typically a very long and complex process that historically takes, 10 to 15 years. But with COVID-19, of course, we had no time. So we carefully looked at ways to shorten this timeline while maintaining our standards for safety and quality. So the same standards we apply for every vaccine we develop. Given the severity of the COVID-19 pandemic, our development program implemented what we call a light speed approach to move faster than ever before, without, however, compromising on our commitments to safety, scientific rigor, quality, and integrity. So I thought that of all the vaccine technologies, mRNA was probably the technology that would help us move fast and give us the best fighting chance for a successful vaccine, a vaccine that would provide the most comprehensive immune responses. Once I actually saw the early results from our phase 1-2 studies, I was convinced that we were on the right track and that the focus on the mRNA technology was the best one for our efforts to try to prevent COVID-19. So as you know, we started human studies in the spring of 2020 in our landmark global phase 3 study, which is still ongoing, in July 2020. With rising rates of infections in the summer of 2020, we were able to reach our case count in the phase 3 study in late fall. Once the data were unblinded, we saw stellar efficacy and a solid safety profile. And these data helped us, as Susan, you mentioned, receive authorization for emergency use in many countries, starting in December 2020. And just to give you an example where we are today, we now have supplied globally already 1 billion doses. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Janssen. I'd like now to introduce Dr. Peter Marks, who heads up the FDA's Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. Since the start of the pandemic, he's played a key role in nearly every decision related to vaccines, from whether to throw out 60 million doses of vaccine, possibly manufactured under unsafe conditions, to whether to pause the J&J vaccine when questions arose about side effects. In short, Dr. Marks' job is to make sure what you're putting in your body is safe and effective. Dr. Marks?
The pandemic has presented for us a number of challenges at FDA. The one I'll focus on right now are vaccines. We were challenged with this pandemic to do something that had not been done before, which is the wide-scale distribution of a vaccine under emergency use authorization. And when I mean wide-scale, I mean across the entire United States. That meant a little bit of building the plane while flying it. And I would say we're still building the plane a bit. The emergency use authorization authority that we have at FDA is one that allows us to make available medical products that are not approved when they may be effective and that their known and potential benefits outweigh their known and potential risks. And that standard for treating a disease like COVID-19 sounds very reasonable to many people. But for prophylactic vaccines preventing the disease in healthy people, most people seem to want something that is a higher standard. And because of that, we put out guidance in 2020 that made it clear that we would hold prophylactic vaccines for COVID-19 to a standard that was higher than that floor of what is the emergency use authorization authority that we have, and that we said that they would need to have clear and compelling efficacy or effectiveness from adequate from trials that were conducted that were large, randomized, phase 3 trials. And that's was done to help reassure people that when we made them available, those vaccines available under emergency use, they would much more resemble vaccines that are approved under biologics license application. The biologics license application, compared to emergency use authorization, requires additional information, additional safety information, and additional manufacturing information. Right now, there's a lot of question about why we can't move very quickly from an emergency use authorization to a biologics license application. And one of the reasons is that a biologics license application means that we have examined all of the data, that we have essentially nailed down, battened down our impression of what's going on with the vaccine. It doesn't say it doesn't say that anything about the fact that the emergency use authorized vaccine is not an excellent vaccine and we shouldn't be using it. It just means that there are additional data once we license that we have to review in order to make it available. And so in this pandemic, as we are, everything we do is towards trying to make sure that when people see what we do, it's transparent and that they can make a decision about the vaccine to take that vaccine based on the information we provide. So as we come to a biologics license application, people will be able to be assured that we've done our normal approval process in terms of looking at all the data, looking at each individual's data in order to make sure that this is the kind of approval that we do for any vaccine, not just in this setting of the pandemic. Our goal is to get that done as quickly as we can. We have essentially a team of individuals that are working tirelessly on that. And once we have an approved vaccine, then we're hoping that additional individuals will feel comfortable taking that, because we know very well at FDA that it's not a vaccine that ends a pandemic, it's vaccination. And so that's why much of what we do is with the confidence of having public confidence in mind. So we take that into account here. And so that's been our motto. Hopefully, we will see an approved vaccine in the not too distant future, and hopefully people will take it and we'll get this pandemic under control.
Thank you, Dr. Marks. Finally, let's turn to Dr. Helene Gale, who heads the Chicago Community Trust, one of the nation's oldest and largest community foundations. Before that, she was the CEO and president of CARE, an international humanitarian organization. Dr. Gale has also worked at the Gates Foundation, the Centers for Disease Control, where she addressed HIV/AIDS and other global health issues. Dr. Gale now focuses on closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap in Chicago. Her wide and varied career experience puts her in the unique position to see whether access to health care, especially during COVID, is playing out equitably across racial and socioeconomic lines. Dr. Gale?
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be joined by the esteemed panelists, and really thank Maria and the Foundation for the National NIH for doing this, and you, Susan, for your excellent moderation. As you noted in my introduction, I've kind of had a perhaps non-linear career, much of it starting out focused on public health, both domestically and globally, and then more on issues of economic inequality globally, and now at a community foundation. And I say that to say, the vantage point from which I speak is kind of the nexus and juncture of those worlds colliding. This is the first time that we have had a global pandemic that caused an economic crisis. And so while much of what we have focused on has been around, how did we come up with some of the solutions to this global pandemic, we also had this economic crisis that drove economic inequality, particularly in communities that were most disproportionately impacted. So as the head of the Chicago Community Trust, where we've been focused on economic inequality, when this first hit, we recognized very early on that it was disproportionately impacting communities of color and communities that were already economically fragile. We quickly mounted a fund where we raised tens of millions of dollars to be able to help people with meet some of their most basic needs: food, shelter, cash to pay bills, PPE, et cetera, to really make sure that we were meeting needs at a community level. And what we heard from communities was, while they were very concerned about the health impact, it was some of these immediate needs that were initially not thought about that were top of mind. You know, the digital divide, lack of access to stable housing, food. And we all know, you know, throughout the nation, we saw food lines like we have not seen in decades before. Small businesses that were already vulnerable closing in poor communities. And so a lot of these things framed a lot of the work that we focused on at a community level. I was then pulled back into kind of my public health roots when I was asked to co-chair for the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine the framework for an equitable allocation of the COVID-19 vaccine. This was actually in the days before we knew what what vaccines were going to be authorized for use, and had to develop a framework that the CDC and the NIH asked the national academies to develop, to really look at what would be the framework, what would be the principles for an equitable allocation of what we knew in the beginning would be a scarce resource. And we really looked at tried to put into place principles of equity that would help frame how this vaccine was distributed, when it was authorized, how it would be distributed so it got to the communities that had been most hard hit. Many of these, the communities that we know already suffered from lack of access to health and health technologies. And so it was a major effort to really think about how do you frame this in the face of a lot of uncertainty, but grounded in equity. And I would just go back to one of the earlier commentaries that we also thought about: what did this mean globally? And what was our obligation as the United States, not only to think about how we made sure that there was equitable allocation of vaccine in this country, but how did we also think about the rest of the world? Then another pivot was, you know, once we actually had the vaccine, how did we make sure that we were getting it to the communities that needed it the most? Both populations, particularly in the early stages, the elderly, but also to populations, um, essential workers who had put their health at risk, communities of color who had huge history of vaccine hesitancy. How do we work around some of these issues to make sure that vaccines were getting to those populations at greatest risk, and have now developed a community-wide vaccine program to really make sure that we're getting vaccine to those who are at greatest risk, not only because of the important health issues, but we also know, again, that those who have been most impacted are also those who are the most economically fragile. And as we think about our role as a community foundation, having equitable access to vaccines is core to our mission of having equity more broadly. So, you know, this has been quite a journey as we've thought about these different phases of where we started from, how this has impacted people at the ground level, and how having this life-saving vaccine it has made such a big difference for so many, but how it needs to get to many, many others, not only here in our country, but also around the world.
Dr. Gale, and we're going to jump into the Q&A portion of our panel, and we can bring back all of the panelists, really. But I'd like to start really with the point that you just made, Dr. Gale. So you set up frameworks to try to make sure there was equitable distribution of the vaccine, both in the United States and around the world. How do you think we've done with that?
Well, you know, it's obviously a mixed picture. And as we know, this pandemic has rolled out with a lot of misinformation, a lot of mistrust. And as we try to get the vaccine out to people, we've had to reckon with that. You know, in the beginning stages, we were talking about a lack of supply and high demand. Now we're talking about, at least in this country, adequate supply, but uneven demand. So we have a lot to do to fix that here in our countries. And as we know, we're starting to see pockets of surges in populations that are largely unvaccinated. But I think also we've got to think about how do we walk and chew gum at the same time. We can make it available to our population and be generous for the rest of the world. We know that no one is safe until everyone is safe. And unless we start thinking, in the United States, it has always played a leadership role in global health, I think we have a huge responsibility to make sure that we're also thinking about the needs of the rest of the world, where, in many places, less than 1% of people have had access to a vaccine. So there's a lot of work to be done. There is so much that has happened in such a short period of time. And so many of my colleagues have talked about the remarkable breakthroughs that we've had in science. We just got to make sure that those breakthroughs and that science gets to everyone.
Well, absolutely. And actually, I wanted to turn to Dr. Marks, if I could. You had talked a little bit in your remarks about the emergency use authorization and how that might play into vaccine hesitancy. Are you surprised by just how much hesitancy there is just in the general population to get this vaccine?
So I guess there are two ways of answering that. No and yes. No, because we've seen over the years that vaccine hesitancy has crept up again. And no, because we've seen how social media is absolutely pernicious with creating all sorts of falsehoods that worry people about vaccines. So that's not surprising. Yes, because we have a safe and effective vaccine, actually safe and effective vaccines that can prevent one from getting hospitalized or dying from COVID-19, which is a very real disease. It is not a fake piece of fake news. It's not renamed flu, as some of the social media stuff that's out there says sometimes. It's not a way for pharmaceutical companies to make money. The fact that it's out there and we have something that's this good to prevent it, it's mind-boggling to me to be able to have a vaccine that comes up with 95% effectiveness, not just in younger individuals, but in older individuals as well. And we're talking about the old even. It's remarkable. It's a gift from above. Somewhat like that. Or it's actually a gift from the tremendous work of some of the people on this call even. But we're just lucky that this happened. And so it's a yes and no answer. No, I'm not surprised because of knowing how vaccine hesitancy develops. But yes, because you would think that in the setting of something that works so well, that actually has a very, very reasonable side effect profile, that we would be all rushing to get vaccinated.
Well, and I think Dr. Swaminathan very memorably just called this the first pandemic of the social media age, and I thought that was a good way to put it. But I'd actually like to ask Dr. Janssen, coming from Pfizer, what do you say to people who don't want to get vaccinated, and what is it that isn't being said that can make people feel safe and underscore the importance of them getting vaccinated?
Yeah, Susan, that's a very good question. And if we would have the answers, we probably would have solved it already. But let me reflect on it a couple of different ways. There are clearly individuals that need more information. So those are individuals that, and it has been spelled out that way, that say things like, well, once the vaccine is fully licensed to Dr. Marks, then it really has gone through the absolute everything that the FDA and other regulatory agencies always do to ensure that the vaccine is safe and effective. And so there's a certain proportion of individuals that are waiting for that because that's what they're used to, and they really want to be, absolutely certain. So that will happen in the not too distant future. Then are those individuals that do not understand benefit risk. So those individuals think that just because it's a vaccine, there is something unsafe about this. And to those individuals, I think one needs to put comparisons in front of them. Comparisons such as, the chance from dying from an automobile accident, for example, that nobody hesitates to get into their cars and drives off. The chance of dying from this are far, far, far higher than what you would ever encounter with a vaccine. And so I think that's really the education of benefit risk, and what the ongoing disease is doing still, unfortunately, in this country and globally, and put in perspective what the risks are. And getting infected by SARS-CoV-2 is far worse than one could ever think about. A vaccine side effect could actually be, or the rate at which those occur. And as Dr. Mark said, these vaccines are highly, highly effective and also very, very safe. And then I would say there is a proportion. So that's education. Giving examples, explaining to people what we call benefit risk in a clear way. And then, of course, there's individuals that, and I think the political climate is not helping, that just almost kind of poo-poo the whole situation. And I think one has to remind people that they have an obligation. Living in a society, I think we all have an obligation to contribute to the well-being of that society, and making it clear to them that by refusing to get vaccinated, even though there may be no good reasons why they cannot be vaccinated, is actually putting the vulnerable at risk, their own children, the children of others. And so really explain that what makes vaccines so powerful, and this is why I mentioned it into my earlier comments, we have the opportunity to really control those diseases, even eradicate the diseases. But what it takes is that everyone works together and that everyone gets immunized, so that we can actually drive the disease out of a country and out of the world.
Well, and the whole notion of everyone working together, I think, really comes up in a question that I had for Dr. Swaminathan. I mean, the WHO declared a public health emergency of international concern on January 30th, 2020. So very early. Some said it wasn't early enough, but it was it was very early in this whole thing. But many countries really just ignored it. And so why do you think that happened? And what do you think we need to do differently to make sure that would never happen again?
Thanks, Susan. I think that's a great question, and that's something that we have found very difficult to deal with, because as I was saying earlier, when you have a virus that does not respect borders, that treats all human beings the same way, you need a response also that crosses national borders. Countries and leaders agree to work together, agree on certain rules of the road, and agree to collaborate essentially. And so I think the fallout of not having that has been this uneven response that we see around the world, where some countries have done a very good job of controlling the pandemic. Many of them, did an excellent job for the last 18 months. And now, unfortunately, with the Delta variant, even they're seeing some clusters. But many other countries were unable to, or did not take the public health advice seriously, did not trust their own scientists and public health leaders, and that's resulted in enormous amounts of suffering and death. And even what we see today, I think, with the vaccine inequity, in some ways, the WHO in April of 2020 launched the ACT Accelerator and the COVAX facility, essentially to address the issues of both being able to work with companies and other stakeholders to accelerate the development of new tools, vaccines, diagnostics, etc., but also to ensure equitable access. And this is because historically we know that people in low-income countries get left behind when there are innovations that the world discovers, but it takes sometimes, in the case of HIV, more than a decade to people in the African continent. And so that's why COVAX was developed. And I think without COVAX, we'd have been in a worse shape than we are now, and is really beginning to pick up now, the supplies. But still, if there had been some, again, a global conversation, what our first priority was? To me, the priority was to save lives, to prevent unnecessary death. If 3.5 billion doses of vaccine that have been distributed around those arms, if those 3.5 billion doses could have been used to inoculate the most frontline, the elderly, those who were going to die if they have a higher chance of death if they get the disease, we would not be in a situation today still having 7,000 or 8,000 dying from COVID. But unfortunately, that did not happen. And so I think it's really a lesson for us as humanity. How do we want to face these big global challenges, whether it's climate change or antimicrobial resistance, another pandemic which could come upon us at any time. I mean, there's no really predicting when the next pandemic could come upon us. And we need to reflect on whether this was really the best response that we could have mounted, as a global community. And I don't think it was. And I think we need to learn lessons. And that's why the World Health Assembly will debate the need for a pandemic treaty where political leaders will come together and agree in advance on these, rules of the road and guidelines for that everyone will follow when there is a next pandemic.
Well, and actually, that's a great segue to Dr. Lane. Dr. Lane, as an infectious disease expert, what have you learned from the way we've dealt with this pandemic that will help us prevent the next one?
I don't know if this comes from infectious diseases or not, but certainly the thing that I think has been, for me, one of the most important lessons learned out of this pandemic is the importance of consistent messaging from the top down in both the political systems and the scientific systems. And what you see even to this day is respected individuals from both of those groups providing information that is contradictory. And the public hearing that really can't sort out who to believe and who to treat more skeptically. And I think without some way in which we can be sure that we get agreement on what the most important messages are, that we get those messages out there repeatedly, tell people what you're going to say it, then tell them what you said. We're going to end up in a situation with varying degrees of responsiveness to what are very important public health measures initially, and then hopefully targeted therapeutic and prevention efforts sequentially, such as monoclonal antibodies for treatment, vaccines for prevention.
Well, you've kind of asked the question I was about to ask everyone, and it really comes from the audience, which is, what's the most important message for the public and policymakers to consider as the big lessons learned from this? And so, Dr. Lane, you're saying, tell them what you're going to say, then say it, and then tell them what you said. So that consistent messaging. I would love to ask everybody on the panel what your big takeaway is. What is that most important message? And maybe Dr. Gale, how about you go first?
Yeah, I guess, when I think about messaging, part of it is who's your audience. And so, when I think about, there's the audience that we want to hopefully take advantage of the innovations and the technologies that we have. And then there are the people who need to be prepared to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again. And so to that latter group, I think this message of being prepared is so critical. We were caught flat-footed. Luckily we had decades of scientific investments that did pay off. But I think it just, reinforces why it's important that we continue to think about funding important research that maybe we don't always know what it's going to be useful for today. But by continuing to make those advances, we will be prepared for the next pandemic, for the next public health crisis. But we also have to make sure that we continue to invest in our public health system. We are really good when there is a crisis in increasing resources to fund the capacity to test, deliver, screen, monitor, distribute, et cetera. And then we let that system, kind of wither on the vine when we're not in the middle of a crisis. So we've got to really make sure that pandemic preparedness, our ability to have the kind of workforce, to have the systems in place, surveillance, et cetera, that we did not have, so that we are prepared. And, we can give analogy after analogy about other things that we don't know if we're going to need them, whether it's our military might. We continue to fund, even if we don't know whether we're going to use it. Why don't we have that same sort of intensity around what we need to make sure that we can fight the next pandemic battle with the kind of rigor we need and have those systems in place? But then I think, when we think about the people who we're trying to reach, and we've all talked about this issue of hesitancy in many ways, and it's both having the right messages, and as Cliff said, saying it and saying it again and saying what you said before and over, that consistency in messaging is clearly so important. But it's also making sure we have the right messengers. Do we have people that people trust? Do we have the right institutions involved? Are we giving them the right information? And are we making sure that our messages are as captivating as the counter messages that they're hearing? So I think we've got to think about who the target audience is and how we're making those messages consistent throughout.
Thank you. Dr. Marks, let me ask you, what is your big lesson learned here for the future?
I would probably say it's that from the beginning and continuing on, we have to be committed to following the science through this process, to explaining the science, to continuing to explain the science, and fend off a lot of the fiction or other things. I think that the times when we've got into problems in this response were where when we strayed from following the science closely, and whether that be, and that's not just the hard science, physical sciences, it's also the social sciences. So I think we have to really do our best here as we move forward with both our more traditional physical sciences as well as social sciences when we respond to pandemics and as we continue this pandemic response, because we are by no means out of this pandemic yet. And so I'm hoping that ever more we continue to follow the science. Science is ultimately shared truth. And if we could get to some shared understanding of truth here, we'd probably have better vaccination rates. It's just that we're not there yet, at least in the United States.
Thank you. Dr. Janssen, what is your lasting lesson takeaway from the last 18 months?
Well, number one is that we learned that we were utterly unprepared, even though we had years and years and years and years to get us into a situation. I remember, that I'm doing this for several decades already, and I remember that we talked about influenza pandemics, 25 years ago, and yet we were utterly unprepared for, it wasn't an influenza pandemic, but it was a different kind of pandemic, but we were unprepared. So I think I would hope, but I'm not so sanguine actually that it actually happens, that for the next one and for the ongoing one also, that we just get into a much better state of preparedness. And also, I think what this requires, and we see this in this country and other countries, that the health of how we are dealing with health, particularly in an emergency, it's still very fragmented. It's not just about one country versus another, but we have within each country different states that have different guidelines and deal with health issues very different. So I think we need to to get the trust back in an institution or institutions in each country that people are looked to and said, okay, we are getting the guidance, and everybody follows the guidance to make sure that next time around it's not as devastating as this one has been. So I think there's a lot of work that's ahead of us, and I think a lot of effort needs to be spent, because otherwise, as I said, I'm not as sanguine that the next one, which can be just around the corner, will end up, any better than what we're still dealing with right now.
Dr. Swaminathan, you already talked about the world needing to work as a global collective, really, in the battle against these. So let me ask you a slightly different question, if I could, which is, how important is it that we find the source of this pandemic?
It's quite important because I think we can learn a lot from that. And essentially, it's about trying to do everything to prevent another pandemic of this kind. And of course, we all know, I think everyone on this panel has said that, we've always expected a pandemic, we've prepared for it, we've still found ourselves taken by surprise. But the fact is that with globalization and urbanization and deforestation and the way in which we're living with our environment or not living in harmony with our environment, the chances of human and animals coming together, and domestic and wild animals coming together, and viruses doing these species jumps, the chances of that happening actually are increasing every year. And we need to understand the factors and what actually causes it to happen, because that will then help us to prevent it. Is it because of the wet markets where live animals are sold? Is it because of the breeding of wild animals? Or is it because wild and domestic animals are bred side by side? Is it because of the... So what is it? And we need to get to the bottom of this, just like we have for the other origins of the SARS-CoV and the MERS coronaviruses. It took some time, it took a lot of work, but ultimately we were able to do that for Ebola, for HIV, for all of these other zoonotic diseases. So it is an important piece of work. It helps us to understand better how these events happen, and therefore will help us prevent future pandemics. I think one other lesson I'd like to talk about is about models of research and development for public good. And I say this because apart from COVID, we have a number of other public health problems around the world today, and tuberculosis is one of them, but there's malaria, and there's diabetes, and there's cancer, which kill millions of people, and for which there's a lot of investment in research and development in the high-income countries and even in middle-income countries. But the fruits of that research are not necessarily available to everyone. So I think thinking about what are the problems that we want to solve as a world, public health problems that need not cause so much of suffering and death, and how can we do that with a new model of public-private cooperation and collaboration, where both the public and the private sectors are needed for this kind of thing to happen well. But then we really think about what comes out as a public good that's made available to all those who need it across the world. And we have to find ways of making that affordable and accessible.
Well, and that gets to a lot of the equitability issues that Dr. Gale has been talking about. I just wanted to pose one last question to everybody on the panel, and we're going to need to keep our answers pretty timely. But we've talked a lot about the challenges and the learnings out of this last year and a half. But I'd like each of you to, if you would be willing, to share what is your proudest moment. I mean, this has been a moment where, for all of the difficulties, this has been a great moment for science. And so I would love to hear what has been the proudest moment for each of you in your work. Come on, don't all jump in at once. All right, I'm going to call on somebody. Dr. Marks.
Yeah, I think probably it's being part of a team of people that really did something that I think people thought was impossible. And we had just a small part of it, the end part of it, of getting the emergency use authorization for a COVID-19 vaccine done. But having been a part of that process and part of that team, felt very special.
Dr. Gale?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in some ways it's part of the same theme. I think the fact that there was such incredible mobilization, and that this was a moment that really required many of us who are veterans of a variety of different public health challenges, came together in a way that I think was remarkable. And I just feel very proud of the fact that the issues of equity in our country and around the world were front and center from the very beginning. And we haven't often started that way, thinking about how do we make sure that we try to recognize that all life has equal value, and we act in that way. We still have a ways to go, but I think the fact that that has been a cornerstone of this from the very beginning and people have mobilized as such was very heartening for me.
That has been a big part of the conversation, certainly. Dr. Lane, how about you?
So that's such a difficult question. So I won't know that I would say proudest, but I guess most grateful for, or something along those lines, was the fact that I saw our institution, the NIH, come together in a way it never had before. I mean, our institutes tend to work in pretty siloed areas. We sometimes will talk across, but this was one time everyone came together. And reflecting a little bit, I think, on what Dr. Mark said, there was enormous pressure to do a variety of things that just did not fit with what would have been standard scientific principles. And we were able, I think, to hold the line there. And it was not easy. It was quite a challenge. And I was always very appreciative for the support that I felt when we were in that position and holding that line, to get support, from my boss, from his boss, up the chain here.
How about you, Dr. Janssen? I mean, obviously the vaccines have played such a crucial role in the progress we have made.
Yeah, no, I would say that, in my long career, I mean, to be able to develop and bring to the public a vaccine in less than a year, that makes me very proud. And also being able, as a pharmaceutical company, to demonstrate that when we and others, we all work together and put our minds together, we can really deliver. And, that's why I mentioned earlier, to be able in the short period of time, since we got the authorization in the United States and elsewhere, to produce 1 billion doses and have them already shipped. I think that is an amazing feat that has never been done before, and it just shows what we are capable of if we really all get together and want to get it done. And so I feel very proud about this.
And Dr. Swaminathan, you get the last word on this subject.
Well, thank you so much, Susan. It's been an incredible honor and privilege to have worked side by side with colleagues at the World Health Organization, that, being in the center of something like this, a pandemic, an unknown, working with experts around the world, including Dr. Marks and his colleagues, and Dr. Lane and his colleagues at the NIH, with every scientific institution around the world trying to find solutions. I think scientists have been united and have had excellent collaboration, openness to sharing knowledge and sharing data, and the willingness of people to give off their time. The thousands of experts that WHO calls upon, to develop our recommendations and our guidelines. I mean, it's really, you feel proud that so many people give so much of their time. And then I think a very small thing, but many school children write to me, young children, saying that they have been inspired and want to take up a career either in science or in public health. And I think maybe that's one good thing the pandemic has done, is put science on the front pages. of all the newspapers and television channels, perhaps to inspire the next generation.
Well, it certainly has put science on the front pages. I really did want to end on a more positive note, because certainly this has been an extremely challenging 18 months for our country, for the world, and for so many individuals. But I like that notion of young people getting inspired to become doctors and scientists to try to make the world a better place. That's certainly what we try to do with our storytelling at National Geographic as well. So I want to thank our wonderful panel. Thank you for adding to, in such an intelligent way, to this fascinating discussion. And now I will turn it back over to Dr. Freer.
Thank you very much, Susan. I have thoroughly enjoyed the discussion and your masterful role as the head of Master of Ceremonies. I have to say that I found this panel quite moving, and the people here are really exemplary. They have given credit to everybody else, but they have not given themselves as much credit, and I would like to do that. There are millions of lives around the world that have been saved because of their efforts. I know there were times where people didn't get much sleep. Certainly there was nothing like a weekend or a holiday to get us where we are today. There's still much work to be done, but the people on this panel represent the best of basic science, the best of ensuring that we have access to the medicines and the vaccines and the diagnostics we produce. And the lesson of working together is certainly critically important for today and for what may come in the future. I'd like to thank once again National Geographic and you, Susan, for being our co-host and our media partner. And I would also very much like to thank the Judy and Peter Bloom Kovler Foundation and the contributors to the FNIH Pandemic Response Fund. They helped bring this forum to life. Quiet Leaders of COVID, Shaping the Future of Science was taped and will be available online. So thank you all very much, and goodbye.